Paul swears an oath before God, the churches of Judea did not know me by sight. But Acts tells us Paul went house to house in Jerusalem, dragging believers to prison. These aren't minor discrepancies. One of these accounts cannot be true, right? So how do historians decide which ancient source to trust when they directly contradict each other? Let's lay out the contradiction clearly. In Galatians, Paul claims he made only 2 visits to Jerusalem over 17 years. He insists the Judean Christians didn't know him by sight. But Acts paints a completely different picture. There, Paul stands watching Stephen's execution. He persecutes believers throughout Jerusalem. He makes multiple early visits to the city. These claims are mutually exclusive. If Paul was publicly dragging Christians from their homes in Jerusalem, the Judean churches would absolutely know his face. Both accounts cannot be true. One source got it wrong. Historians untangle contradictions like this using a fundamental distinction: primary versus secondary sources. A primary source comes from someone who participated in or witnessed the events. Paul's letters are primary sources. He's writing about his own life. A secondary source is written later based on other sources or traditions. Acts falls into this category. The author explicitly admits he compiled his narrative from sources. He wasn't there. This distinction isn't about which text is better or more inspired. It's about proximity to events. The person who lived through something has direct access to what happened. Someone writing decades later relies on what others told them. Here's what makes Paul's account particularly compelling: the fact-check constraint. Paul wrote Galatians to people who could verify his claims. His readers lived through these events. They knew witnesses. They could contact Jerusalem directly. If Paul had been publicly persecuting believers in Jerusalem, his lie would be exposed immediately. His entire argument would collapse. The author of Acts faced no such constraint. Writing 30 to 40 years after the events, his audience couldn't fact-check decades-old stories. They trusted the tradition they received. This verification pressure doesn't prove Paul told the truth, but it means he faced consequences for lying that Acts author didn't. But fair-minded historians must consider the counter-arguments. Acts reads like straightforward history, no obvious axe to grind. The author seems genuinely interested in preserving accurate information, and Paul himself repeatedly insists, "I'm not lying," in Galatians. Does he protest too much? Could Paul have reasons to downplay his Jerusalem connections? These are legitimate questions. The primary source advantage doesn't automatically make Paul correct. We need to dig deeper into what each author was trying to accomplish with their text. Every ancient text has a purpose, what historians call a theological agenda. This isn't a pejorative term. It simply means the religious goals shaping how information gets presented. Acts could be titled "The Acts of the Holy Spirit." The Spirit drives every major decision. The narrative follows a consistent pattern. Jerusalem stands at the center of authority. The church appears unified under apostolic leadership. Conflicts get minimized or resolved quickly. This theological framing shapes what gets included and how events get described. The author isn't lying. He's writing with a different purpose than pure historical reporting. He wants readers to see God's hand guiding a unified movement. That goal influences every editorial choice he makes, and that's it. A case study reveals this pattern clearly: the split between Paul and Barnabas. Acts describes a disagreement over whether John Mark should join their next journey. Barnabas says yes, Paul says no. They part ways, a simple personnel dispute, but Galatians tells a different story entirely. There, the conflict centers on table fellowship. Can Jewish believers eat with uncircumcised Gentiles? Peter initially ate with Gentiles, then withdrew when Jerusalem representatives arrived. Barnabas sided with Peter against Paul on this fundamental question. The stakes couldn't be higher. This touches the core of Paul's gospel message. Notice the pattern. In Acts, a serious doctrinal crisis becomes a personality conflict. A fundamental disagreement about the gospel itself transforms into a logistics dispute about travel companions. This isn't necessarily dishonest. It reflects Acts' consistent editorial approach. The author minimizes theological divisions to present a unified early church. Recognizing this pattern helps us read Acts more accurately. When Acts presents smooth consensus, we should ask, what conflicts might be smoothed over? What disagreements might be reframed as minor disputes? This case study gives us a method we can use beyond these two texts. When ancient sources conflict, historians ask three questions. First, who was there? Favor eyewitness accounts over later narratives. Second, who could fact check? Consider what constraints the audience place on the author's claims. Third, what agenda might shape the telling? Identify the narrative purposes that influence how events get presented. No single test is definitive. Historians weigh all factors together, but these questions give you a framework for evaluating any conflicting historical sources, not just biblical texts. What does this mean for understanding early Christianity? The early church was messier and more conflicted than Acts suggests. Paul fought hard for his independence from Jerusalem. He clashed with Peter publicly. He lost Barnabas as an ally over fundamental theological questions. These weren't minor personality conflicts. They were battles over what the gospel meant. Recognizing this helps us read both sources more accurately. We see the real struggles behind the smooth narrative Acts presents. We understand why Paul argues so passionately for his apostolic authority. This analysis isn't about debunking Acts or attacking the Bible. Scholars of all backgrounds, religious and secular, use these same historical tools. The goal is reading ancient sources the way historians read any ancient sources. We ask about authorship, audience purpose, and constraints. We recognize that every text serves particular goals. We weigh evidence rather than simply choosing our preferred account. These methods help us understand what actually happened and why texts present events the way they do. Both texts tell us something true, just different kinds of truths. Paul's letters give us direct access to events as a participant experienced them. His claims faced verification pressure from people who lived through the same period. Acts tells us how later Christians wanted to remember their history. It reveals what mattered to the church a generation after Paul: unity, apostolic authority, the Spirit's guidance. That's historically valuable information, just not about the events themselves. Reading both sources accurately means recognizing what each one can and cannot tell us. When you encounter contradictory ancient sources, you now have tools to evaluate them. Ask who was there, consider who could fact check, identify the agendas shaping each account. The early church's real history emerges not from choosing one source over another, but from understanding why each source tells the story it tells.